So we've talked a lot about how there have been changes politically, with the Democrats and the Republicans fighting, and then the rise of the populists. Now we need to talk a little bit about how all of these changes are having an impact on social issues. And so this particular lesson talks about segregation and racial conflict as it existed in the late 19th century. One of the things you've probably already talked about in your studies of American history is the fact that during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, many African Americans are going to turn to farming for a livelihood. Unfortunately, for many of them in the South, they didn't have land, they didn't have the property necessary to really become successful. And many of them are going to look for other opportunities, and there's going to be a movement called the Exoduster movement, where exodusters, people who are exiting the South, are going to travel to Kansas, where there's a lot of cheap land. And as African Americans move into these parts of the country where populism is actually fairly popular, many of them are actually going to join the populist movement. This is going to make things a little bit complicated because many people who were populists had formerly supported Democrats, and the Democrats had traditionally been the party that was anti African American, or in many cases, these people had been pro slavery just a few years before. African Americans who joined the populist movement, they're going to kind of have their own farmers groups, their own farmers alliances. And just like you had a farmers alliance that predated the existence of the Populist Party, you have a colored farmers alliance where African American farmers are starting their own farming groups. The backlash against African Americans trying to become politically involved and trying to become economically independent in the South is going to be severe. And it's the beginning of our story, a long story that we're going to be talking about this year, about the fight for equal rights and racist actions by individuals and governments. And the first thing that Southern governments tried to do was to disenfranchise African Americans or take away the right to vote. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution after the Civil War ended had protected the right to vote for African Americans. It specifically said the right to vote could not be taken away because of your race. However, Southern governments quickly found a way to work around this requirement. They did a number of things. One of the things they did was they passed a poll tax, which required citizens to pay a fee in order to vote. Many African Americans could not afford the fee because they didn't have economic independence yet. They had just been freed from slavery. Many Southern governments imposed a literacy test requiring voters to pass a test prior to voting. In many cases, the test given to African Americans would be more difficult than the test given to whites. And they also had these things called grandfather clauses. And what that meant was that if you were an individual who had a descendant who had voted prior to 1866 or before the Civil War, then any new voting requirement didn't apply to you. So if your grandfather voted prior to the Civil War, the poll tax didn't apply to you, the literacy test didn't apply to you. Of course, for all the newly freed slaves, their descendants were slaves and therefore they weren't able to vote before 1866. So this obviously was designed specifically to target them. So they tried to take away their right to vote in a variety of different ways. And this is going to be again, the beginning of a post-Civil War story of a struggle for equal rights now that slavery has been abolished. This story is not just about voting rights, it's widespread segregation. And after the Civil War ends, you have decades where mandated and required segregation is going to be institutionalized throughout the South. Jim Crow laws are going to become commonplace, laws that require segregation in a variety of places, be them hotels, trains, restaurants, things of that sort, schools. In 1896, in an incredibly important Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court ruled that as long as facilities are equal, then they can be separate. A guy named Homer Plessy filed a lawsuit because he was required to ride in a separate rail car on a train, and he said that this violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. He said that he had the right to equal services, and the Supreme Court said as long as they're separate, as long as they're equal, they can be separate. And this basically endorses from the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, segregation, and it gives Southern governments legal cover to require segregation and institutionalize a Jim Crow system that's going to be in place for well over half a century. In addition to having the right to vote taken away and having a Jim Crow system spread throughout the South, you're also going to have a rise in racial violence and in lynchings that are going to occur throughout the South. Ida B. Wells is going to be a prominent African American writer and activist who speaks out against lynchings, but they're just a part of the larger picture of discrimination, segregation, and violence, all of which is happening at the same time against African Americans in the South. One of the things we're going to look at in class is the differing viewpoints about how African Americans should respond to this system that has emerged in the United States. There's really going to be two viewpoints that we're going to look at very closely, one from a guy named Booker T. Washington and the other from a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington is going to call for African Americans to focus less on fighting against whites for civil rights and focus more on educating themselves so that they are prepared for equality. We're going to take a look at a document that really highlights this point of view. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, he disagrees with Washington. He says the struggle must continue against segregation and inequality. Otherwise, any education blacks receive will be useless and they won't be able to receive equality. So, in class, we're going to take a look at two different documents. We're going to compare and contrast these two perspectives and talk quite a bit about the ideas that these individuals had.